using our imaginations for a moment, let's imagine the experience of the newly born child. We have been thrust out into a world from a place of safety, security, comfort, even nutrition. All of our needs are met. We are surrounded by a power greater than ourselves, a mother as the host. Hopefully that process has gone well enough that we are then expunged out into a world to become a much more defined or physical independent subject who will, between that experience and those preceding experiences, navigate a planet, a world of forms, of a sense of an individual location that is I, or me, as we usually call it. That sense of seeing a world from here, hearing a world from here, tasting a world from here, knowing a world from here, experiencing from here. Endless objects, including people, places and things. Experiences will be collected. There'll be a seeming sense that we are able to recall previous experiences in order to bring about current tense experiences that are pleasurable by avoiding previous experiences that were hostile and difficult and caused suffering. And hopefully to put enough rooting in place in the present moment to bring about later pleasant experiences. One of the fundamental ways we do this as a species is we collect finances here in order to bring about later positive experiences, because we champion money over so many other things. Though, of course, that's not to say that financial security doesn't, in reality, bring about a great sense of financial security. Of course, it brings more of the same. So there is that, but we soon learn and see, some of us, many of us, that isn't the only type of comfort and security we can find. There are numerous others. The primary example being okay, being who we are, being okay, just being right here, right now, who we are. And that's a whole other undertaking and a couple of other talks. Yet here we are, we're newly born, thrust into this world. So if we take ourselves now, we can do this experientially to the direct experience of being that baby. Though we're the other side of an experience, a movement in which we did come out into a different environment, there's a new environment. We know nothing of language, we know nothing of otherness or other people, we just know the experience of this, just as we did before. But certainly there's something we went through. Whether a newly born infant can remember what it's been through, we don't know. When I say remember, I mean in terms of the difficulty of the birth. That's not to say that in the physical body there isn't a stored consequence of being born. We know there's birth trauma. Certainly it's traumatic for the mother and the father. And certainly that would suggest that the human animal, the offspring of the human animal, the newly born baby, would have some, not recollection, some sense of, maybe not sense of, but some stored notion of the experience of birth. Yet, again, this newly born baby knows nothing of language, doesn't know other people, doesn't yet know too well sight. It is just a beautiful bundle of experiencing, but has no words to describe that. Language isn't its initial learning function. So we know now that for the first 2 years of life, there is more developmental processing going on in terms of spatial awareness, similarly otherness, in terms of the building blocks of all of the development which follows thereafter, the physical body, the psychological body, the cognitive body, the neurological body, the emotional body. We know newborn babies register joy, sadness, discomfort, and pain, amongst other things. I'm sure they know much more. Yet until around 20 years 2 months, the process of imaginative and recalled memory doesn't begin to develop in terms of, as language develops, the ability to articulate or to respond from primary experiences. So this primary socialization doesn't begin until kind of the 2-year mark. This is why, as so often is described, some babies are labelled as going through the terrible twos. Around 2 years old, that sense of being a lone subject that is experiencing the world through its senses, seeing otherness everywhere, that and this, mine, not mine, want, don't want, like, dislike, and so on. And in the beginning of the deeper grounding of this, there is an assurance and a reassurance and a self-navigating and self-developing sense of I-ness or me-ness. We call ourselves I, we call ourselves me. And don't babies often say mine, 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 this idea of getting. So we develop and we begin to school and be schooled, and we learn from our parents, we learn from our historical lineage, we learn from our culture. We are given all of these things. We are given culture, we are given initial learning, we are given morality, we are given beliefs, we are given likes and dislikes, we are offered all of these things, and we are shaped according to our time in history. What mummy and daddy likes, what our sisters and brothers like, that often we don't like, because that sense of otherness needs to separate itself from that which it is learning to be combative about. There's a sense of wanting to be different to that which is very close to me. This really comes to fruition in teenage years, when we kind of begin to reject all of this initial stuff that we're given. But essentially we are shaped and we are moulded by our initial development and our family and our time frame in history. We go to school, and this plays a massive part in conditioning us in order to comply to the current trends of what is acceptable in our society and what is fundamentally considered good and healthy and that will lead us in a right path, and to develop a sense of the opposite of that, which is what is considered unhealthy. Now, of course, there are fundamental and intrinsic and culture and historical wide ideas, especially around morality, of what isn't helpful. We're taught not to harm others. We're taught not to be selfish. We're taught not to neglect a physical body and not to cause harm to others' physical bodies. We're taught respect and dignity and again morality. And of course what these teach us inside of their conceptualization is the very opposite of all of those things, and why those are bad, and how so-called bad, and how should we drift into those things. They're unacceptable and they're ugly and they're wrong. And this, again, once more, in children and in human beings as we develop, it's good for us to learn from a way of being that is very pro and con, right and wrong, quid pro quo, good and bad. This is good, though it's not the whole of the onion for development. Whilst it is, those are good building blocks to learn either orness, they're not ultimately great mechanisms for developing a broader sense of openness towards life and to otherness and to acceptance around other people's foibles, acceptance around our own foibles. We can become very trapped in mechanisms of shame and guilt, self-loathing, introversion, negative introversion, because we are still so rooted in that still developing mind of youth. this is why when we get to teenage years and we go through what I would readily describe as the trauma of puberty and the years of the teenage development thereafter, which for me seems to be a process where it takes the rest of our lives to figure out, or a large portion of the rest of our lives to figure out, to work out what on earth went on there as we went through biological changes, hormonal changes, psychological changes, emotional changes, and we moved on from that early development into teen years development, which involves leaving school, moving out into a so-called adult world of much more of a sense, an ingrained sense, and putting into practice for the first time how it is we're supposed to do things around here, how we're supposed to work, how we're supposed to provide, especially as men, not exclusively, how we're supposed to parent and mother, especially young women having babies. Excuse me, I can't get rid of this cough. And it's a really challenging time, and so people that become parents in young ages, as they do in many cultures, and they just get on with it, later look back and feel as if they missed out on things as teenagers, generally fun, and generally that sense of independence that disappears when you become someone who has dependents that depend upon them. So there's all kinds of sacrifices, and parental love is a sacrificial form of love. Of course it is. It's the development of a form of sacrificial love that we never lose thereafter. That stays with us until we die, that of being a parent and having a responsibility and an accountability, and the scars and wounds that can develop from that if we're not developed enough to become a parent, that we're still in that either-orness, and we're still in the mechanisms, and for many of us the difficulties and trauma that we went through, that our parents went through, as we pass on cycles of dysfunction and codependency, brokenness and unfinished business and buried wounds that we have not worked through yet, that we haven't broken the chain in generational cycles of trauma and difficulty in the way that many of us do. Any breakage within generational and familial and social and world trauma, as we've now seen, that are still with us, are inherently passed on, are innate in our makeup. And until we work through our bullshit, then we're more apt to pass our bullshit on. As wonderful contemplative teacher I'm often citing, Richard Ross, states, if we do not transform our pain, we will transmit it. And where do we all transmit our pain at first? Those closest to us, those within our circle of relationships that move out from intimate partner, intimate relationships in family, friendships are moving out of circle, workplace friendships, strangers that we encounter, those are relationships. People we'll never meet, these are a relationship of people we'll never meet. And so on and so it goes as we move out into the largest picture of all that is the world story. Those are all relationships that we have, and a relationship with people that we don't have is still a relationship with people we don't have. We move into our 20s, and once more, as we did when we hit puberty, we look back at our teenage years, often, though not always, and think, wow, what was that? How naive I was, how I have thought and felt, certainly in my experience, by the age of 13, I had all of the answers, though I didn't know the questions, but I would have an answer if you'd have posited a question to me. And I look back in my 20s, we can often look back in our 20s and think, well, I was a dumb kid, I made some stupid choices. And how difficult it is to overlook how many brilliant things we did as teenagers as well. And the fun of it, as Lennon said, John, not Lenin, youth is something that's wasted on the young. And how true that is in my case. I think that was Lennon. That's a good quote regardless. I went from playing out as a child and enjoying bike rides and trees and forests and hanging out with boys and the smell of girls, to, in my teenage years, hanging out with boys and enjoying the smell of girls. In fact, That's an ongoing thread. But just, that richness of youth and that fun and that exploration and discovery is just beautiful. And getting to 20, and then so many of us are like, well, I've really got this figured out this time. And we move into, perhaps further into the workplace, or we move into ways in which we find ourselves newly being creative, or we have a more developed sense of being an independent person, navigating a world of others, of likes and dislikes, and kind of realizing that we now like some of the things we disliked before. And so some of those things that we were very black and white about, we've become much more open to. It's just beautiful, really. And we start to develop the wisdom of a 20 or of someone in their 20s. Now, of course, many of us go through much earlier stages than this of very difficult and complex experiences that bring us to a sense of wisdom that is usually attributed to people much older than we are. Children go through cancer. Children survive difficult experiences. I myself, my mother left the body in this plane when I was very, very young. And so although that for me turned into deep-seated, uprooted trauma, these adult experiences at a very young age, at an inappropriate age, are traumatic. That trauma stayed within me for a long time, and there was a lot of acting out around that. There was a lot of ways, maladaptive ways in which that manifests. But there was a deep-seated, eventually to be nurtured sense of wisdom. Perhaps that's apparent here, I don't know. I'm not overly educated, I'm somewhat educated, I'm certainly privileged in certain ways. But the reality is that I went through that experience, and it was hideous, it was horrible. But 40 years later, having had sufficient work done to me, not claiming to be the arbiter and actioner and agent of that work, but so much wisdom has been offered me that I've been able to reflect on what rises out of hostile, negative and traumatic experiences that is good. And that is always there. That seed of goodness is rooted in trauma. But we mustn't bypass or spiritually bypass, emotionally bypass, psychologically bypass or suppress. Because what we suppress re-emerges on us. What we neglect will round on us again, and it will have us. If we don't explore change, if we don't explore transformation and change will come and grab us, generally by the throat. So out of that, into our 20s we move, and perhaps we marry, perhaps we do have children, perhaps our design for living that we were given in our early development is really taking root, and we're doing well in the workplace, or we're travelling, or we're successful at being creative, or we've been able to contribute to some bigger story in life. Perhaps we're working in social care, perhaps we're a drug addict, perhaps we feel like a failure, perhaps we're still locked in that trauma, perhaps we're still enslaved. To be enslaved is to be unable to even imagine an alternative to the present way, unable to even imagine an alternative to the present way. And there we are, life isn't moving along society, cultures, communities, familial, political, or the way in which we were schooled and conditions design. And because we don't fit in and because we don't conform, we feel like a failure, and it hurts. And we feel isolated and desolate and outcast. We are legion. Or perhaps we've chosen an alternative path. Perhaps we're a Trustafarian and we grew up in very comfortable financial circumstances, or emotionally and psychologically comfortable circumstances. This is a cynical way of looking at things, of course, but this is just one of the patterns in which the archetypal human experience manifests. We begin at what we might here call an upper level of living, where everything is just fine and security is just taken for granted, even perhaps. And so our experience of life, some people of course sail through life in that way. Is it sailing through? Who's to say? There are plenty of people that had it hard, that did experience trauma in childhood, like myself, that's come to terms with that and has embodied that and lives with that. and that they are able to see that they were rich regardless of matters of life that they went through. But nonetheless, whether we're bottomed down and we move up to that sense of happiness, peace and being, or we already know a form of happiness, peace and being, and then life pulls the rug from under us and we are humbled into a state of reasonableness, that we then also find our balance and we all find peace and happiness. This is, after all, the nature of the search for meaning, is to find happiness and to live in a way in which we find contentment in the day, in the larger story, even in the universal story. And then we hit 30, we move through our 20s, by now we might have children, we might be happy travelling, we might be destitute, and we still haven't quite found happiness and peace. But here we are, we've hit 30, and life is the way it is. We're still operating out of that egoic sense of self that we were conditioned with at the first, that sense of I am me, here I am, and I'm a failure because life hasn't gone the way I wanted it to go, or that I was taught it should go. Some shame in the shoulding. Or I am happy and I have these lovely children and my partner is beautiful, I have a lovely husband, I have a lovely wife, I have lovely relationships with partners, I've come to terms with my agenda and my assignment. However that looks for us, it's all just quite brilliant, isn't it? And there's contentment. So whether there's suffering or contentment, here we are, we've hit 30, now what? And there's another layer of deepening sense of wisdom and okayness, or the absence of wisdom and okayness, and still making stupid and dumb choices, as I did, speak from experience, at that age. Still not fully able to actualize my everyday experience, not able to move from my single egoic story and the tools for the first half of life into a bigger picture, into a bigger story. I hadn't hit bottom with the way of living I was given and developed. Then I was given a very okay sense of okayness, but I couldn't really fully actualize it. There'd be relationships, and there'd be peer groups, and I'd keep moving through them in the ongoing quest through different tribes to find what I was looking for. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew the feeling of not having it when that appeared. Generally, the trigger point was the demise of relationships with significant others. I'd empty out again as the trauma of growing up without a mother would re-emerge, attached to this newly developed collapse of relationship around feminine energy. And there was the inherent sense of feminine energy that came with me. We all carry masculine and feminine energy, amongst others. But as I was left with just my own unrealized sense of feminine energy, I'd say at that point, although it was manifesting in particular ways, a sense of emotional incongruence that was a desire for emotional congruence, that resource in and of itself and those which would be labelled inherently feminine weren't sufficient to bring me through. And there were some great and inspirational people around me that are springing into mind now that brought that to me as friends and cohorts and tribal fellows that I loved and loved dearly. But in and of myself, I wasn't enough. With my lens fixed firmly on the outside, and this isn't an uncommon thread, many of us, naturally, most of us at those ages, early 30s, we look out into this same world through the same eyes that we did as children, as teens, as 20-somethings, into a world of workplaces, travel, creativity, suffering, harm and hurt, brokenness, relationships, illness in the physical body. We look out into that world searching for meaning and happiness, peace, purpose, relationship, otherness, and find successes and find failures in that. But we look out into the world with the same eyes that we were given by our kith and kin. Around the age of 35, of course, often our elders are now getting older, or the people around us might encounter, or we encounter ourselves, ill health and difficulty. And so we do begin to experience struggles and suffering. We know that psychology suggests that, it has been suggested that by psychology, that from the age of 35 into 55, as we move into middle age, that the tools that we were given for the first half of life, the gifts we were given, begin to stop working. Should they be seen as us as gifts, capacity for relationships, academic qualifications, workplace successes, should these gifts be seen as us as successes when jobs come to an end, when we do experience ill health, when we don't find we're able to navigate a new place in the workplace, when relationships end, when difficulty is encountered, we find that the tools that we've used for the first half of life aren't always sufficient to bring us through this current difficulty. In fact, wisdom teaching suggests, whichever school it comes from, psychological, spiritual, emotional, philosophical, real world, seems to suggest that between the ages of 35 and 55, we will encounter necessary suffering, what the wisdom teachers call a necessary suffering. Perhaps someone dies, this is very common at that age, perhaps our grandparents die, and we experience the inability of the current resources that we have for life. We encounter the failure of the programs for the first half of life. And the gift, the wisdom-given gift of this is that life is calling us to the essential questions about a bigger picture than our own, about a bigger picture than the story that we were given for the first half of life. We are being called to big mind from our small mind and our small sensory experience. We are being called from I and thou, I and it, into us and we. Many of us miss this calling, many of us miss the messages, many of us, nearly all of us, struggle so much at this time. Men, we know, not exclusively, some women too, go through midlife crises. Most of us, many of us, not most of us, navigate these with some degree of tenacity and resilience, perseverance. Plenty of us have no access to resilience, tenacity and perseverance through such experiences. We grieve, we break, we fall apart, we collapse. Do we stay in that collapse? Do we get stuck in grief? Yes, we somewhat all do. If you were to look at grief patterns for human development, there's what's called complicated grief and uncomplicated grief. Complicated grief is essentially getting stuck in the process of grief, in the shock, in the trauma, in the sadness, in the anger, depending on what model of grief you look at. We can get so stuck there, most of us do. We have a mechanism in the human world called moving on. I'm not sure I've ever moved on from the loss of my mother. There's certainly been a sense of embodying that experience, but my mother has never gone anywhere. The place in which I experienced my mother when she was present, the 11 years for which I knew that experience, is the same place I experience her now. That is, in awareness, in consciousness, from this specific locale, just as all the other things one might say I've lost and that have passed along the way. It's not it's not a mechanism of memory in which I experience them. It's in experience that I experience that which isn't on the physical plane anymore. Certainly in my current understanding. Experience is always experience, whether the physical body is here, whether the conversational or psychological and emotional body is here. Yes, of course, those are the things we miss because we take experience to be the objects that we experience, the things that we experience. And they're not here now. but the experience of those things remains the same. When asked by a therapist years ago, do you still talk to your mother? It never occurred to me to do so, so I did on the bus on the way home from that session, saying, are you there? I dared ask the question. And there was an experience of the sense of, yes. And then there was a conversation about missing each other that was integral to a turning point in the therapeutic process that I later had to come back to, that I later had to come back to, that I may later have to come back to. It's really just beautiful stuff, really. In this way, nothing is missed and nothing is lost. But on the physical plane, certainly, all of it is missed and all of it is somewhat, no, it's not lost. We're not going somewhere, we become everywhere in that way. Nothing is lost, everything is gained because we embody that person. So, have I moved on from the loss of a parent? No, but the embodiment of that relationship is innate, is inherent, is who I am. I am that which I came from. In this way, lineage is embodied and actualized. So, many of us go through such experiences. That's just one way of looking at it. That little aside there was one way of looking at how we navigate that and what happens as a result of years. That makes it sound like I've done a lot of work around that stuff, of living for years and being able to reflect back 44 years now to a childhood experience and navigate what that experience now feels like and what that experience now is. And probably a lot of applied meaning going on there. All meaning is applied, but I've applied a lot of meaning to things there. And hopefully some of that meaning has come out of applying meaning in the past that wasn't realistic or was the meaning that I needed to apply at the time, that now, some of it might seem like nonsense, really. You know, like the idea that, why did my mother leave me, which was a process that I had to go to. Being angry about her dying, being angry about death, being angry at cancer, and all these necessary things at the time were bullet points of navigating the terrain of losing a mother as a child. So human beings go through difficult experiences. Maybe it's our health, maybe it's the health of others. Maybe our child dies. I can't think of anything worse. Maybe there's illness in the physical body or we have an accident. But certainly we'll go through the necessary suffering of the human experience. And if we're able to attend to that in a way which enables us to be transformed by it, no. The ego would like us to say, I did this and this is how I got over it. I attended to this process and that's how I got through it. Be careful of that I, of that me, taking credit for what it's going through. I mean, I did the same thing. Ironically, there it is again. But later on was able to reflect back, just as we've talked about the nature of being able to reflect and see that it was done to me. I wasn't doing it. It was being done to me. Life itself, the bigger picture that emerged out of all transformation, that emerges out of all transformation, should show us that. That's a healthy should, not a shaming should. Life is being done to me. I'm not doing it. It's being done to me. If we come to that place, and I'm in that place, or that place is happening, then truly we have been radically transformed to the big mind experience. We move out of I, me, mine, the little story, into we around here, the local, familial, community, nationalist, national, people, human story, and we move into big mind and awakened consciousness, or into consciousness itself, in which everything belongs, in which animals and people, we all share this physical plane. We are we. That's exciting. That's really exciting, and I feel excited. And here comes the sun. How lovely. Of course, here comes the sun. And we move into this narrative of the larger story, the bigger picture. we move into wisdom and the autumn of our days, and life does begin at 40. Having been 40 15 years ago, absolutely no doubt that life with a larger L begins at 40. Before that, it's life, little l. Before that, for many of us, it's love with a little l. And this isn't to make tripe of being younger than that. It is, life is brilliant. Life as an ocean, small l or capital L, it's just incredible, isn't it? How amazing is it, from misery to ecstasy, from brokenness, emptiness, isolation, to awesomeness and ecstatic experiences and inner travel and navigating inner space and looking up at outer space and thinking, who knows what's going on up there, though we like to, go to the equivalent of the corner shop by travelling to the moon and putting our telescopes out into some of it and speculating on what it means and how it is and what it should be. And that's super exciting too. But equally exploring inner space, moving into our interiority and having life force us to, offer us the opportunity to ask larger questions. Grounding ourselves in the wisdom traditions, reflecting back through the work of tribes, philosophers, academics, writers, children that ask amazingly profound questions, going back through all of the accumulative learning of the human animal thus far and coming to our own understanding, reaching the emptiness of absolute understanding of the I see, of seeing and having eyes to see, and being rooted in that for the beginning of every morning and every experience and every encounter and every outward offering of ourselves into the lives of others. And perhaps attaching ourselves to a larger story, perhaps with our own silence and our own offering of simply being around vulnerable people. It's not filling up their suffering with words and advice and suggestions, though that too. Perhaps the best suggestion when around vulnerable people, as someone who's worked with vulnerable people for 20 years, is to point them to the people with the answers instead of assuming you have the answers themselves. We live in a world of diminishing funding into critical social care. There's a political statement there. I work in that field, so I'm talking about my own tribe. And I'm speaking from experience, because as our political world becomes ever more interested in the accumulation of finances for the few and making that sound like an appealing suggestion towards the many that will never attain those levels of financial security, as our world champions that and that fragmented, fragile notion for how to experience life as a human being is radically and enduringly collapsing around us. The counter swing of the collapse of our political structures is that sense of simplicity and emptiness and simple living, and it's forcing us as an animal to move inwardly into exploring inner space just as much as we do outer space. The internet's a wonderful resource for this, and the internet is a wonderful resource and a lousy master. So there's a whole bunch of political stuff now, but there it is. And we are, as a human animal, coming to terms with the nature of our limits and asking broader and deeper questions. And we are being set free from the mind that would have us reach higher forms of material success. We are coming to emotional success, communal success, tribal success for the entire species. As we destroy our environment, as we will necessarily come together. Perhaps in the actualization of the human experience, there won't be many of us around. I certainly won't be around to see ecological success in my lifetime, not at this age. I'm 55. But perhaps as the human game and it's looking like it's possible as the human game shrinks in its capacity to live on this planet successfully. And of course, what will happen out of that is the top end, the elite end of the human waltz, the human dance, will create an ever-increasing narrative of constriction, of consume and conserve, and I, me, mine. That's the nature of its engine. And those of us that do live on the margins of societies, in brokenness and in poverty and in destitution, that are the communities that reap the devastation of the collapse of the environment and the institutions, well, they won't make it either. There'll be plenty of people that won't make it. We shall see, but there will be an inevitable coming together. There will be a community that emerges out of that. There will be a commonality and a community consciousness. And perhaps we're here already. Perhaps that somewhat dour description from this seeming vantage point, with a whole lot of opinions thrown in. Don't take my opinions too seriously. Hopefully my shared experiences can be helpful. Maybe, who's to say? Doesn't matter. But that nub in the middle, that commonality that emerges out of the collapse of the top and the relinquishing of the bottom of the spectrum of the human experience, again, we will be brought much closer back to that balance, much closer to that peace and happiness that we knew as infants, as we come together and we work together, as I'm going to say many of us, if not most of us, already do. You know, we're not all arseholes, and most of us aren't suffering. If we can only get the arseholes to be less of a bunch of arseholes and do more, and many do, let's acknowledge that, do more to serve the poor, then perhaps we'll come to the recognition that we've always been there, we've always been here, we've always been in the middle, and we all are. And we all are able to know peace and happiness as a collective, rather than just being concerned with my own portion of that. I think it's pretty clear I'm empty.